Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for Let's Vote. Thank you to our panelists and our sponsors who are listed in the program, which you all should have received, and if not, we'll be passing them around. Today, I'd like to acknowledge several of the individuals who work tirelessly behind the scenes to make First Wednesdays possible. Please raise your hand or stand up when I call your name. My coworker, Lori Rice, our volunteer, Mary Hunt, Steve Durr, who records this event for our website, and Jeanette Rhodes of WFYI, who provides the sound. So thank you so much for everything that you do, and please join me in thanking them. When the ACLU of Indiana decided to tackle this topic for First Wednesdays, we decided that on the issue of voting rights, we had to look forward rather than back. At the ACLU of Indiana, we win many cases, and we also lose some. In the case of voter ID, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Indiana's law in 2008, which we challenged but were unsuccessful. So what can citizens do? We can make sure everyone we know, our family, our friends, coworkers, and neighbors know about their voting rights. How do we do this? We talk to them. We show them the flyers that we have available up front, and we take them to register to vote, and we get them a valid ID. Please pick up a handful of the flyers on your way out. We are thrilled to have Amos Brown moderate this program. We all know Amos as the host of Afternoons with Amos at WTLC. And anyone who has heard his program knows he cares deeply about the issue of voting rights, and he cares very deeply about this community. Thank you for being here, Amos. Finally, if you like these programs, if you appreciate our work at the ACLU of Indiana and you want to see us do more of it and do it even better, please donate and join with this envelope on your way out of the door. Thank you, and now I give you Amos Brown. Let's vote.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
If I remember and was awake during my American history classes, and they told us about how this country started, this experiment in democracy, I believe when they had election days back in the day after the Founding Fathers wrote up everything, signed it, and ratified everything, it was a bunch of guys with property or money who I believe would either gather at the local restaurant, the local courthouse, or the local tavern, and they would cast a ballot. And everybody knew who everybody was in the town. So if they were there in New Jersey and somebody from Georgia showed up and said, I want to vote, everybody in the town said, man, you ain't from Georgia. One, you have a Georgian accent, we have New Jersey accents. But I say all that to say, when this democracy was created, we only had one class of voters, and you know who they were. Everybody, it was like Friend. It was like Cheers. Everybody what? Knew their names. It was easy to vote. Now we're a country of 300 million individuals, probably 200 million eligible voters. Talking about the ones that were born, naturalized or born here, who are eligible to vote, and we're in a much more complex society. So how do we as a nation live up to that original ideal of everybody gathering around where everybody knows your name? Or what is that little town in New Hampshire that always votes at like midnight? Was it Notch, Dixville Notch, where they all vote at midnight? And I don't think when I see that on CNN or Fox News, I don't think anybody in New Hampshire is showing an ID because everybody in Dixville Notch knows who they are. How do we get to that American ideal of voting in a complex society and make it fair so that the 1/100th millionth of a voter who is committing fraud gets caught and gets locked up in jail, and the 99.9999999% of everybody that's doing it right gets to vote? That's the issue. We have Aaron Kelly here from the Historical Society, community servant leader. Beth White, This is her busy time of year. She feels like she's an accountant around tax time. At this time of year, the clerk of the Marion County Courts and her 91 compatriots all across the state don't talk to them until November the 7th, really. And then State Senator Brent Waltz, the pride of the South Side of Southern Marion and Northern Johnson County, State Senator, pride of Wabash as well. Guys, welcome.
Thank you.
Let me ask each of you, we know what the ideal was when this country was founded in terms of voting. How do we live up to that ideal today in the more complicated society we're in? Aaron? I'm going to start with Aaron and move down the line.
Well, thank you. Well, thanks for having me here. I want to thank the ACLU. And just to mention, I'm here wearing my Legal Women Voters hat today, not my Historical Society one. My employer might want me to clarify that. You know, America was founded on a great set of ideals laid out in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. But as Amos, as you pointed out, those ideals really didn't include everyone. And democracy has to rest on this idea, I think, of hope. And I don't mean that in an Obama-esque rallying cry, hope. But I mean, if we don't believe that we are truly valued in this democracy, that our government doesn't care or want our vote, then we're not going to participate. So I do think a first step in trying to encourage voters to come out is to have a system in place that welcomes them to do so. And one of the fears that the League of Women Voters has is that voter ID shuts a door for some people and really kind of pulls in that welcome mat that you are welcome and invited and encouraged to participate in this democracy.
Senator?
Thank you, Amos. I'd like to thank the ACLU for hosting this fine event. As a senator who actually voted in favor of the voter ID law a few years ago, I do support having voter ID. I was a history major at Wabash College, as Amos alluded to, and certainly we know that the historical ideal, if you will, throwing the hat over the wall, as Thomas Jefferson did when he talked about all men being created equal, he did not mention ethnic minorities as part of that. He did not mention women as a part of that ideal, though today that has been far more inclusive than perhaps what the Jeffersonian construct was 230 years ago. So I think we need to recognize, one, that the nation of the United States is different than it was in 1776 or 1783, or perhaps even 1912. But we also have to recognize, too, I believe, that there is a balance that must be struck. Every vote counts or should count, and that means that voter fraud that we have seen, unfortunately, in some cases, dilutes the legal votes as well. So while we must be committed to make sure that every vote counts, we also must be committed to make sure that every vote is not diluted by fraud. And the steps that the Indiana General Assembly took a few years ago, I believe, were a reasonable test to accomplish that.
Clerk White?
Thank you, Amos, and good afternoon now to everyone. I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate it very much, Kelly, for you organizing this. My take is a little bit different than Senator Waltz. I agree with him that voter fraud is bad and that we should find it where it exists, root it out, and prosecute it. But that's not the problem that we have, specifically in this state and in this community. The problem that we have is a lack of participation. The Civics Health Index, which was published about a year ago right now, which was a joint effort, it's actually a national effort, but the Indiana effort was led by Justice Shepard and Lee Hamilton, our former member of Congress, showed that we are 48th in voter voter turnout, 48th in turnout of the 50 states. And we are 43rd in voter registration of the people eligible to register who actually do. That is the problem we have. The legitimacy of our democracy is at stake when people don't participate. The connection between the governed and the government, and I am the government in that analogy, it breaks down when people don't think it speaks for them or it matters to them. And obviously what we have in Indiana is a lack of participation. That is our problem, and that is what we ought to be addressing, and I think this forum today gets us started, and I appreciate that.
Let me go, before I get to the contentious issues, let me get to some of the simple issues in terms of improving voter participation. I have said repeatedly, and I'm trying to help Republicans and independents in the suburban counties, I think it is unfair for someone to be stuck in a traffic jam on I-465 or I-69 or I-65 trying to get to their home polling place in the suburban counties. It's 5:55. There's a long backup. They're not going to make it by 6 o'clock. What is the impediment to changing Indiana's voting hours, either going to 7 to 7, 7 to 8, 6 to 7, some permutation, or providing maybe rural counties with the option that if 6 to 6 really, if keeping open to 7 o'clock goes against their lifestyle. I've been a Hoosier now long enough to be respectful of our rural areas and small towns. But are we at a point where in the larger metropolitan areas we really need to look at a 7 o'clock closing?
Well, may I?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. First of all, I think if you're going to do something, you need to have it be statewide.
Okay.
I would hate to have somebody who moves from, say, Kosciuszko County to Hamilton County, or somebody who moves from Ripley County to Johnson County, thinking, well, gosh, the polling opened at 6 and back in my home county, and I moved, and now it's 6:10. Where is everybody? Why can't I vote? So I could imagine that there would be a fair amount of disruption when there's that type of movement. I personally don't care if we vote from 7 to 7. I'm not much of a morning person anyway, so the later the election, I'd probably be a little perkier anyway when I shake people's hands and ask them for their vote. So I would not feel bothered or concerned by that, but I think we would need to be consistent statewide.
Has there been any buzz in the legislature from either side of the aisle as to what the resistance is, other than we're Indiana and we're slow to change?
Well, as a group of people who fought daylight savings time, I voted for it, but as a group, we had fought daylight savings time for decades. The words, "it's always been done this way," seems to resonate frequently amongst members of the Indiana General Assembly. So sometimes when we put forward a notion that there might be a better way to do something, that prior response is frequently heard. And so, I'm not condoning it, but it's certainly something I've observed in the 8 years I've been in the Senate.
Clerk White or Aaron, you want to add in on that?
We need to expand the voting hours for the people of this state, and I call on the members of the General Assembly to do it. There is always a bill introduced every single year to do that, and it never, ever gets any traction. So I agree 100%.
Voting reality in the state does not match 21st century needs, and that's something that I've talked about in the past. I think that expanding hours should be an option. I think satellite voting should be an option. I appreciate early voting efforts that take place in this state, but I do believe a level of consistency across the state that expands options would be a wonderful way to go.
At the time voter ID was adopted in this state, we only had one class of driver's license and one class of state identification card. And even though the most onerous part of getting those cards is the birth certificate, that was the system then. We now have a dual system of licensure. We still have the old-fashioned driver's license, an old-fashioned ID, which will allow you to drive a car, which will allow you to vote, which will allow you to cash a check. But if you try to get on an airplane at any American airport, you will be stopped because that's not a secure ID under a federal mandate, where this is why I'm getting ready to get conservative now, Senator. The federal government said, you don't do it this way, you get no money from Uncle. And to get the secure ID is now a little more difficult. You got to prove you got a social security number and show it. You got to bring the birth certificate. You now have to really prove that you live where you say you live, even though voter ID does not require the address to match what you do in the book. Do we need to be concerned that at the point in which the next governor may decide everybody's going to secure ID, because it was our governor that said, let's keep a dual track system for a while? Do we need to worry about that, Clerk White?
Yes, we absolutely do. We do, and I know that the proponents of the voter ID law say that it is easy to get the ID that you need, and I am going to tell you it is not. I'll tell you just a really quick story. My husband moved here from California in 2006, and he wanted to vote for me So he wanted to go get an ID. He had a valid California driver's license. When he went to get a valid Indiana driver's license, they told him that was not good enough. He needed a birth certificate. He was born in the county of Los Angeles. He needed a lawyer in California to go get his birth certificate. And I was lucky enough to have a friend in Los Angeles who practiced law. She went, she got his birth certificate. She FedExed it to me so that we could go and get him a valid driver's license. Now, this is what people go through when they're trying to get the ID that the General Assembly has decided they need in order to vote. It is a challenge. The secure ID is only part of it. This was for a regular old ID. And I think that this is a problem for people, and not just people who are poor, but all people. And it ought to be something we're concerned about.
And another problem with the process that I see is that it's BMV administrators who set up the regulations for the kinds of documentation you need to take with you to get the driver's license or the ID card. So these aren't even elected officials that we can hold accountable. And I do have concerns about that fact, that they're doing their job, set out the documents you need to get an ID, but that ends up affecting who has access to the polls on Election Day. And I think it should only be elected officials that have some kind of say in that.
Well, using Amos's analogy about the New Hampshire town, if somebody wanted to vote 3 or 4 times in the town hall, I suspect their colleagues and neighbors would have said, wait a second, didn't you just vote 5 minutes ago? And we've seen instances, not just in Indiana, of course, but really nationwide, of some pretty serious matters of voter fraud. We need to be mindful of that. So the fact that we would have a voter ID that we would have to present, I don't feel particularly threatened by that. I don't feel particularly bothered by that. A person who goes to a video store to rent a DVD does not feel, I'm sure, particularly threatened by presenting an identification card to do that. And the DVD rental company certainly has a vested interest in making sure that that person is who they say they are. Would not we, who safeguard democracy, hold our citizens to the exact same standard? I would hope we would.
Amos, I'm sorry. May I?
Yeah.
I can't let that go unresponded to. We're talking about a fundamental constitutional right, not renting a DVD or getting on an airplane. And the reality is that there is not a single case of documented in-person voter fraud in the state of Indiana, not a single case. There is voter fraud that has gone on with mail-in absentee, which is exempted from this law, by the way, but there isn't a single case. This is a solution in search of a problem, and it does impact people, and we have to look closely at the impact it's having on people.
I would respectfully disagree. Certainly, your representatives and senators that represent 6.3 million Hoosiers, at least a majority of them, felt that this was an issue and that this was a problem, and so we collectively, attempted to try to resolve this issue. I think the right to vote is precious. It is a constitutional right, and as such, we take that very seriously. And so for those people who would suggest that this would persuade someone not to vote, as the study that Clerk White had mentioned, I would respectfully ask, what was that percentage before Indiana's voter law? And I would argue that it would probably be fairly consistent with what we see today, which is obviously way too low.
But let me bring back, because the law of unintended consequences in changes in the law. Let me first ask Clerk White. What instructions are being given to our 600 polling places in this county when a voter walks in on November the 6th, or they walk in with early voting, and their driver's license has just been renewed? They are waiting for the new license to come in the mail, because BMV says you no longer get it at the place, you got to come in the mail, and they walk in with the little paper receipt. What counts as the ID?
Yeah, we train our poll workers very carefully on this issue, and I actually conduct the training by video myself. The paper copy of I guess it's a transitional license or whatever they call it.
Receipt.
Right, the receipt. If it has a picture on it, and I have seen these, by the way, a copy of a license with pictures on it, then it can be used. It is permitted to be used. Now, the other thing to know that Senator Waltz, of course, knows very well, that there is a fail-safe in the statute, which permits you to vote a provisional ballot, and then you have 10 days to come and present that ID. And this happens with people, by the way, who get their purse stolen the day before Election Day. This happens all the time. I get calls like this every single election. My purse was just stolen. I don't have an ID. I need to vote. I can't get to the BMV. What can I do? Well, you can vote a provisional ballot, and then you have the opportunity to present your ID. We also get this question, by the way, with learner's permits. I've been working in the high schools for the last 6 weeks doing our curriculum, registering voters, teaching them how to use the machines. We've registered thousands of students in all the high schools in Marion County, and I get that question a lot. What about my learner's permit? Is that good enough? And the answer is, if it has the picture and meets the other criteria, then yes, it is good enough. But again, Amos, I think we have to come back to the point that this is confusing. People are confused and frustrated by this, and many students who hear me do my presentation say, well, I just don't have the ID I need, I'm just not going to vote. That's the answer. And so what happens is people are confused.
And that's the league's ultimate concern, is that the messaging that goes out to the public because of these voter ID laws is that you don't matter. It's more, you have to jump through hoops to be able to participate in this government. And if you're not willing to jump through hoops, then you really don't care. And I think that's wrong. I think it's a harmful message. I think it undermines democracy. I do believe that we want, a safe election process, and we want the integrity of the vote maintained. But to restrict it so specifically to one form of ID, I understand passports count too, but essentially one form of ID that it's BMV administrators that write the rules for to get, is too narrow, too restrictive, and ultimately it hurts us. It doesn't help the system.
Well, again, I would just say respectfully to just one comment on that. It's not just one form of ID. It can be a state identification card. It can be a state driver's license. It can be a passport. So there are a number of different options available to a citizen to use.
Of a certain class and means.
Absolutely.
I mean, let's be very clear there. The average person does not have a passport because that is not affordable.
That's very true, but anyone can walk into a BMV and get a identification card for free.
If
With
they
the
know,
underlying
because
documents.
the BMV doesn't always ask them if that's what they're there for.
And the Indiana General Assembly specifically made that point where the taxpayers would foot the bill for that ID card if asked for free. Paid for by the taxpayers because the Indiana General Assembly at the time deemed it to be that appropriate that a person who might not have sufficient means or could not afford an ID card on their own should be allowed the opportunity to vote. Obviously, it's a constitutional right.
And I think, Senator, being fair to the legislature, you all did that in good faith, just as you said this should be the preferred ID in good faith. But I'm wondering whether this temporary print off your computer, here's the picture, to me, and I'm just an honorary lawyer, that goes against the legislative intent of what the legislature meant by ID, because that, printing something off of paper, I don't think a bar in Broad Ripple is going to accept that as an ID for you to drink. That's the first thing. The second thing is going back to, and I lost my train of thought, so I'll pick it up a little bit. It goes back to these changes that are made in BMV. We've had complaints of people who go and ask for the ID, and the BMV workers, because they're thinking like a business, try to uproll them into, oh, it's going to cost you $12, and forget to tell them it's free. Well,
if that's true, and at some point in the state of Indiana has a BMV worker done that, possibly. I've not heard of any reports of that, but if they've done that, that would be wrong. And clearly, they need to be properly educated. That if a person comes in and trained, if a person comes in and wants a photo ID card, they should be doing that. There should be no upcharge or upselling that would go along with that. So I would agree with you, Amos, on that.
At the same time, I was arguing with Todd Rokita when he, introduced this, and he and I would have these great philosophical fights on the radio. But respectfully, it was not like a Fox News fight. He also was pushing vote centers, which is an idea that has been tested in 3 counties and seems to have died. And the reason I bring that up is we now have the statewide voter file where any voter can go and find out whether they're properly registered. It's a great system. If theoretically vote centers means that if you walk in and say you're Amos Brown and present some form of identification and you vote, then you press a button and that name is locked out, so I could not go and run down to Bean Blossom and try to vote a second time. Is the compromise, instead of a restrictive voter ID, moving forward and making the public investment in vote centers?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay. First, it's important for us to understand what we're talking about. Vote centers are a change in the way we do voting on election day. And this is something that we hear a lot about, but we don't fully understand what we're talking about. Vote centers, again, are a change. They are a new way to vote. And it allows a person in Marion County to go anywhere in Marion County. Currently, our structure for 150 years has been neighborhood-based voting. You go to a place in your precinct, it's a community center, a school, a fire station, and that's where you vote. Vote centers permit you to vote anywhere in the community. Again, that's a change. It is legislatively authorized, by the way, for every county, and it is something that could be a good option. And Amos, I'm intrigued, frankly, by your linking the lack of a need for so much ID to the vote center concept, because they can't vote more than once, obviously, with the vote center concept, because we don't have poll books. Marion County is thinking about vote centers. It's something we might think about going to. It requires new technology, which is important. But what I will say is that there is a baby step toward vote centers that we should have, which is an expansion of satellite voting. Satellite voting is early voting at additional locations. So early voting starts in my office on October 8th, which is a couple of days from now. And we have tried for 2 years now to get an agreement from the Republican Party in Marion County for satellite voting. We had it in 2008, North Central High School, the Southport Town Hall. It was wildly successful. 72,000 people voted early in Marion County in 2008. And we can't get the Republicans to agree to this baby step toward the new kind of voting. And so I'm not holding out a lot of hope necessarily that, at least in Marion County, we can get reform on board with the Republican Party.
12 years ago, I was a candidate for the Johnson County Council when I was 26, and it was the very first time I ever ran for elected office, and I was standing in front of Maple Grove Elementary School in Johnson County. And a young couple about my age came in, parked in the parking lot, walked by me, and I was holding up a Brent Waltz for County Council sign, and I asked them for their vote. And they told me they said, "We'll vote for you, Brent, no problem." They go inside, and about 30 seconds later, they come out. And obviously not enough time for them to have voted. So I looked at them and I asked them if they'd voted, and they said no. They were in the wrong spot. They were supposed to vote at Center Grove High School, which was literally 100 feet away from Maple Grove Elementary School. You could throw a baseball and hit the side of the high school. And they said, well, it's just too much trouble. We're not going to vote. And it struck me for a couple of reasons. One, those were 2 votes I thought I would probably get that I wasn't going to get. And, you need every vote you can. The second thing that struck me as very interesting and very telling was a story from South Africa. An 86-year-old African woman stood in line for 14 hours through the night so that she'd be able to vote on the first multiracial election that South Africa was going to have. And when a columnist asked this lady why she waited 14 hours to do that, she said, "I'd like to vote one time as a free woman." Now, compare and contrast those two perspectives, and it really is a sad commentary in a lot of ways that our society does not vote on the levels that they do. Again, using Johnson County as an example, we have voting centers. And I voted in the primary in Johnson County, and I waited in line about 35 minutes. It was the longest wait I've ever had in the 20 years that I've been voting. And it was because it was not done perhaps as efficiently as we would have liked. A lot more people came in. Normal wait time would be maybe 5 or 10 minutes, so it was 3 times that long. I saw people in line saying, well, it's just too much time, I have to pick up my kids, I'm not gonna do it. And so there's no single silver bullet to any of these. For every time we talk about ease and having someone be able to vote in one location, sometimes you have these unintended consequences of longer lines and people walking away because of the lack of convenience on another side.
Let me follow up on that, because a lot of the calls that I get on election day, and the county clerk knows this, are customer service issues, are irritation, are human mistakes, because we're all human. What can we do as a state, as a community, to make that voting process for people easier, or to use the business buzzword, more customer friendly? To make it like the license branch is now, not the way the BMV was 20 years ago.
Aaron?
Now
I
I really got you on the spot.
Well,
now.
No.
I'm someone, I work on election day, and I have for a number of years now.
Thank
so
you for your service.
I'm one of those people that arrives by 5 and puts in the 14, 15-hour day.
Yes, she does.
What I would like to see, I think there's a lot of confusion oftentimes I find on the part of voters when they come to vote. They think that I'm an employee of the government, and that, you know, this is my job to be there. They don't understand that we're talking about community volunteers, basically. So I think there needs to be some greater education on the part of what public expectation should be when you walk into the polling location. I'm volunteering, you know, I'm there for a very long day because I believe it's the right thing to do. I do believe training has been enhanced over the years, but I know that I've heard from other league members, there's discrepancy throughout the state regarding the kinds of training that clerks and judges and others who work the election day get. So I'd like to see some kind of standardized training throughout all 92 counties. I don't know how possible that would be, but I think it would help a lot in terms of enhancing customer service and getting people in quicker.
Education becomes critical, not just for the people that are working on election day, but the citizens themselves that are voting. Voting is a sacred right. It is also an awesome responsibility that we have. Because you're putting on elections, and not every day, not every week, not even every year, there are going to be snafus. Sometimes polling places that we saw over the last couple years in Marion County were going to be open at 6, but they didn't open at 6, and some of them would open until 9 o'clock, and so people would have to come back. When I first ran for the state senate 8 years ago, they ran out of ballots in some places, so they were trying to print ballots out on a copy machine and be able to approach it that way. So there are always going to be issues. There are always going to be problems. But being able to understand and appreciate the fact that people are doing this on balance for the right reasons, the volunteers are there, they're doing the best they can, and being able to make sure that our citizens get that, no different than we would ask, we would forgive trespasses as we would forgive those who trespass against us on that. So.
Well, Amos, since I'm the only person sitting up here whose job it is to actually implement what we're talking about, I feel a responsibility to be specific and not general. First of all, Senator Waltz, in Marion County, we have 600 precincts, and that means I need 3,000 poll workers. And we have consistently, over the 12 elections that I have run, improved and improved and improved our ability to get the polls open on time and to get those workers where they need to be. Now, I always say, and Amos, you've heard me say this, that no election is perfect, and 3,000 people are not going to be in the place they need to be at any given time. Someone's going to get sick, someone's car is going to break down. So we have human error, and I think Aaron's point is a really good one, which is that the people who volunteer to participate in the process deserve a level of support, training, and help, which is what they get from me. And I also agree with Aaron that there is a lack of consistency statewide, and I'm not sure what the solution to that is. But to your point, Amos, and I am getting to your point, that is what we need to do is make the voting process more convenient for people. And I said a minute ago, I said this notion of satellite voting, which is early voting in other locations, is something that we really need. In 2008, the people of this community voted with their feet. 72,000 of them voted early because it was convenient, evening, weekend hours, 10 days before the election. That is what we need to do. And again, we have not been able to get an agreement in order to do that. That is what I believe the solutions are.
I got a question here from somebody that's here that wanted me to ask this, and I think I also saw a letter in the Star the other day that was similar, and this deals with, wait a minute, why do I got to show a driver's license to vote? You already sent me this voter registration card. I thought that was the card I was supposed to show. Then somebody said, wait a minute, if I already got the voter registration card, why don't you just put my doggone picture on my voter registration card and you kill two birds with one stone? Is part of the confusion and you know we're Hoosiers, so we don't like change, that, wait a minute, you gave me this card, this kind of flimsy looking card, every time I register to vote, or every time you want to make sure I haven't moved, or you're trying to cut down on fraud and you want to make sure you do the purge. Where's my picture on that? Why isn't that the ID? I thought that really was the ID.
The reason why that would not be as effective as some other forms of identification would be a person moves into Indiana. Let's say, Clerk White's husband.
Yeah.
And he says, I'd like to vote. And so how do I do that? Well, you've got to register. And so then you have to prove that you are who you say you are at that point, and through identification. So it would almost be like trying to get a photo ID to be able to have a photo ID. And then you have to be at a place where someone will take the photograph that would be duly authorized, then print the card, mail the card. So I see that as another step. I have no problem with that, but I could as another means or another alternative. But I would certainly want to make sure that what happens usually, a person having their photo driver's license is what they use when they vote, and that's something that's done by the overwhelming majority of Hoosiers.
One of the issues in the original voter ID, which I don't think was ever litigated, or if it was, we didn't win it then, we might win it now if we relitigate it, did he intend? Is in a federal election, in an election for President of the United States, it doesn't really matter where you live. That's an election for all American citizens. Right. So if a student at Wabash College, your alma mater, just happens to be here from New York, and he's attending Wabash College, why is that individual not allowed to vote for president here unless he goes and gets an Indiana ID card, because he really doesn't want to surrender his New York license, because after he gets his degree from Wabash, he's going back to the Big Apple to make more money than he would make here. Well, again, on a federal election.
Well, I hope he'd stay here. We want to encourage as many Wabash grads, or any grads for that matter, coming to and staying in Indiana and getting married, raising families, and paying taxes. We're going to need a lot of money for our road funding, I suspect, over the next few years' time. The reason why that's the case is because federal judges have ruled that while states are given latitude when it comes to local and state elections, federal elections are different. And because federal elections are different because of the Electoral College, I couldn't, let's say, instead of Wabash College, I'm working on my master's degree in Florida in the year 2000. Should I be able to vote in the Florida election and be one of those 600 or 700 people that would have voted for George W. Bush to make him president? Or if someone had voted for Al Gore, you could have changed American history by doing that. So I think federal judges have recognized that federal elections are different. They probably are different for those reasons. And I believe that's the rationale that the feds have used historically on that.
All right, as we move through time, any questions from this august crowd that's sitting here so quietly and patiently? I got a microphone. Sister Jeanette here has a microphone. If you want to raise your hand, she's going to move. She's going to move over there quickly. She's getting her exercise as part of WFYI's wellness initiative.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Amos.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Amos, and to Aaron and to Beth and to.
Put it up to your mouth so everybody. There we go.
I'm one of those people that has worked at the polls and participated in. I can tell you that working at the polls really changes your impression about democracy. Mm-hmm. And the more people we could get to participate in that process, the better. And I go back to this let's vote idea that the law was something looking for a problem that didn't exist. And it was there to keep people from participating. And I can't imagine why we keep chasing this law that doesn't have anybody except for one person, one elected official, who was charged with voter fraud and was found guilty. We have one person that has had that problem, and that is keeping people from participating. They don't call up Beth and say, I want to be a poll worker, because the process has become encumbered. I think that the law is a smokescreen for something else, and whether it's electronic voting fraud that is occurring systematically or other fraud, I think we need to get more people participating. And if we can take the voting law away and let people participate, we'll have more people voting. when we're working at the polls, we are self-policing. We do know the people that come into the polls. I know most of the people that come into my polling place. And I know by noon that everybody on my street has come in and voted. I think we're making a smokescreen with this law.
Well, I was in the room during a lot of the discussions when it came to the law. And I can assure you, unless I'm part of the grand conspiracy as well, which I'm not, I give you my word of honor as an Eagle Scout, which is an oath I've never violated in the 23 years that I've been an Eagle Scout, that was never part of our discussion or our calculation. We were very concerned about voter fraud, not concerned about disenfranchising anybody, not about trying to prevent someone or discouraging someone to vote that would be legally able to vote. So that was our rationale behind it. Now, it's fair to look at the consequences of legislation, and will the consequences equal what our intent was? But our intent was pure on that, in spite of some people's attempt to try to spin it perhaps in a different way. But our intent was pure. I think it is fair to look to see how these reforms that we put in place are affecting voters. And if there are issues, we need to adjust our sails accordingly.
Amos, if I could, I think there's some national perspective that might be helpful here. In the United States in the last couple of years, in anticipation, frankly, of this election, numerous states have done numerous things on this issue of the voter ID, but also other kinds of restrictions as well. Just yesterday, Pennsylvania, a judge in Pennsylvania enjoined the state of Pennsylvania from implementing, in other words, stopped them from implementing their photo ID law. And I appreciate Senator Walt's comment that we need to look at the impact of what has been done, because I think other states are looking at that impact. Judges in other states are seeing that it really has a negative impact. And that I go back to what I said 45 minutes ago, which was the real problem that we have is a lack of participation, not voter fraud, not people voting who are not who they say they are.
And the voter ID law, as much as egregious as I find it personally, and I find it as a representative for the League of Women Voters, it's not going to go away. So I'll be honest, when I'm asked to speak about the voter ID law, I get a little, okay, we're going to talk about it again. I mean, we've tried. I mean, we were one of the litigants that sued all the way to the United States Supreme Court and the Indiana Supreme Court. We've been invested in this, but the law is the law. And as someone who works the polls, I signed the oath when I began, and I uphold that law. So where do we go from here? And participation is the issue. So I would love to see the state get as invested in educating students on civics as it is in creating these voter ID laws, which I do believe restrict voting access. But I don't hear any major calls for getting kids, educating kids about civic literacy. What are those founding documents that give us those values that we share in common? I don't see a great call to have people develop their civic skills so they can communicate with one another in a rational way, so that they can critically analyze new political information that comes in. I just hear about voter ID and it's supposed to do this, it's supposed to do that, and who really gets left out, I think, in this conversation are voters and what they need to be active citizens.
A couple weeks ago, I unveiled a proposed financial literacy initiative, which I hope will pass the General Assembly next year. Sounds like maybe the following year a civics literacy course would be in order, and I would certainly support that. I think that the more wise a ballot is cast, the more informed a citizen is, regardless of their political party, their political affiliation, their political beliefs, the better off our society will be. Well, and that's something I think that we can all agree on.
And I'm running short of time because they're texting me that a movie star is waiting for me in my studio, so I'm gonna leave that today. But one thing I've heard, and I'm gonna let Faye have the last word as I slip out. That's a good way to do that. Is maybe the league and the political parties and the others can approach the broadcasters in the state, because there really has not been the kind of news stories. Here's how the process works on voting when you go in there. There really hasn't been anything in Marion County since we went to the voting system back in, oh my God, 14 years since we changed voting systems. Yeah. So if you really look at what does the media cover leading up to an election, it is polling place, it's the fights, it's whatever. It's not explaining the voting process, and that really has not occurred for a while. Excuse me while I duck out because there's some movie star who's in town waiting on me. Faye?
Faye gets the last
No. As one with a very long history in voting rights issues, my father participated in the litigation, not as a lawyer, but as a union organizer, that ended the white primary in 1944. So it looks like to me that we are coming back to an era where voter suppression, using a different vocabulary, is what is going on. Since no one really has pointed out a real problem in fraud that is identifiable, documented, as well as cured by a voter ID. As one who's lived in the same place for 52 years and have voted in 5 different locations, been in 2 different congressional districts, 3 or 4 senatorial, but every time there's redistricting, reorganization, things change. And it seems to me that adding all these layers is merely suppression, not an effort to clean up a non-existent problem.
I
Anybody would
agree.
like to
Where
respond to
is the
that? Go
problem,
ahead.
Senator, that you voted to cure?
Well, there are several, first of all, to begin with, examples of and stories of voter fraud. I can, well, if I may finish, ma'am. Well, I'm trying to, as best as I can, with the time that we have allotted. We know that there are cases, anecdotally, not proven in a court of law, okay, but anecdotally, of voter fraud. We know this to be, we've heard this in the testimony during the voter information that we had back in 2006, 2007 during the testimony, which I believe you were a part of. But there were discussions of, well, I certainly don't want to interrupt you, ma'am. So if you'd like to continue. No, I mean, were you done with your comment?
Do you state that it's anecdotally, not actually factually documented and proven?
Well, again, what standard of proof would you like to have? Are we talking about in a court of law? Are we talking about sworn affidavits that are notarized? I mean, there's a lot of different standards of proof that we can have towards that. I can assure you that voter suppression was certainly not my intent. It was not the intent of any member of the General Assembly that I spoke to, either publicly or privately on that. I would certainly hate for anyone to think that that would be the way things were moving towards. In other words, we want to be moving forward. We do not want to be moving backward. And if there are some issues where we need to adjust our sails, certainly I think we would be very sympathetic to that.
Thank you very much, Senator Waltz, and for being here, and also Aaron and Beth. We really appreciate your time. Everyone seems to want to know what we can do. What we can do is take 1 of these, take 5 of these, give them to your family, friends, post them on bulletin boards, go door to door and take 50 and give them out in your neighborhood. These we created with the League of Women Voters to inform people about their voting rights, and that's what you can do. So go for it, let's vote, and let's protect our democracy. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for
Thank you,
having
Kelly.
us.